I've at this point kind of lost count of how many times we've talked on the show, but I'm pretty sure that the majority of those times we've discussed physics, and of course, philosophy has been part of that. But today I want to focus on the topic, what is philosophy? And I'm sure in some of these, I don't know, 10 or 12 episodes, in one of them, I've asked you how it was that you got into philosophy, but I don't remember. And I think that revisiting that might be a good way to get to that question. What is philosophy?
Um, well, how did I get into it? I suppose, oddly enough, because I'm just about to hit my 50th anniversary graduating from high school. Um, in my senior year in high school, there was a seminar called the Philosophical Discourse Seminar, which was probably the first time I read philosophy as such. A little bit of this and a little bit of that. Um, and took to it took to it right away. When I was in college, I was taking philosophy from the first year and ended up doing a joint degree in physics and philosophy. Um, and I guess, look, I was the kind of kid who thought it was fun to get logic puzzle books, and just kind of work out the answers to various kinds of questions for no reason at all except to see if you could work them out. So I suppose that will push you in a kind of direction toward philosophy.
I've gotten many answers to this question, what is philosophy, over the years, and especially the first 100 or so episodes of the show when it was pretty much just about philosophical topics. But maybe we should begin with a historical inquiry because today's philosophy is different from a long time ago's philosophy, though they still overlap and it's still ancient philosophy is still studied today. But how, as you see it, did philosophy come to be?
Well, if we go back, I mean, I'm too steeped in the actual etymology of these words to not hear them when you just say it. The term is a Greek term, and as everybody knows, it means the love of wisdom. And pretty much anybody who is engaged in an activity whose main point was understanding, as opposed to, say, creation, craft, or action. You had arts and tech day and crafts, whose ends was making things. Um, but then there's just the pure end of trying to understand things. And anybody engaged in that would be engaged in philosophy. As I point out many times, in the university today, almost everybody has a doctor of philosophy. So they're officially philosophers because they got an advanced degree in some field or other where the main point was just to understand things. And the modern philosophy department, I mean, again, everybody knows Newton was doing natural philosophy and so on. Um, and then as various subdisciplines of philosophy got more and more built up and independent, they got shunted off to their own departments, and you created physics departments and chemistry departments and biology departments. I mean, most of what Aristotle did was biology, um, math departments. And so little pieces of philosophy drifted off from the philosophy department, right? The philosophers of mind of 100 years ago or 70 years ago would often now be in cognitive science departments doing more or less the same thing. And then what's in a present day philosophy department is just what's left. And that's why it's such a weird, odd hodgepodge of various things that don't particularly fit together, right? I mean, aesthetics never kind of went anywhere, so it sits here, and moral theory kind of sits here, but then so does philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of physics. There's so there isn't a lot of fundamental unity to what's left in a philosophy department beyond having as your primary interest theoretical understanding. Now, insofar as things become more practically oriented, in that sense, they become less philosophical, in my opinion. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but the difference between what's called philosophy now and what was called philosophy in ancient Greece isn't the shifting of the entire field. It's a bit parts of the field drifting off and being called something else. In my view, I mean, I think that's historically correct.
Mhm. So this is something that I've often heard, that say like mathematics or biology began as philosophy, or they were all some sort of continuous field, and then as the special sciences developed, they developed their own methodologies and sorts of questions, and branched out and became their own mature fields.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be interesting, maybe since physics is your specialty, to discuss just like how this happened. So, what was happening at the time of the ancient philosophers in terms of physics, the sorts of questions that they were asking, and the methodologies that they used, and then how this eventually became its own branch of science, and then the questions that still remained in a philosophy department.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, as probably most people have heard, what we call the first philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, were often called nature philosophers. And nature, the Greek word is physis. So when you say nature philosophers, you're just translating essentially physicists as the Greeks would understand it. Many of the questions that they were interested in were very explicitly what we would think of as natural science. What are the planets? What are the stars? What is stuff made of? You think of what Democritus, Democritean atomism was a physical thesis. Aristotle opposed atomism and believed in infinitely divisible matter. That's, is that a philosophical question? Well, in the sense of trying to understand it is, but it would belong in what we would now call a physics department. Some of the early people also did some biology. As I said, most of what Aristotle did was biology. What makes living things different from non-living things, and how does all that work, and the basics of chemistry, the states of matter. All of these things were topics. Now, there's a different thread, which probably comes most prominently with Plato, of worrying about ethics and the good and normative theory, right? Not how are things, but how should things be? Or, how is it that they are better? This is what Socrates says he was looking for out of philosophy, and was very disappointed when he got the books of Anaxagoras and couldn't find it. He said he wanted an explanation not of the planets as what we would call physical things, but why it was better that they be as they are. And so then you get, ethics and moral theory. I guess Aristotle starts piling on with the poetics and aesthetics and, all kinds of other topics that are more normative. So you have physics, the name of it, at least according to Aristotle, is, again, the proper translation would be nature, theory of nature. And then if you ask, well, what makes something natural? Why does it categorized as natural as opposed to, say, artificial? Aristotle's answer is, well, because that has within itself, a principle of motion and rest. So if you want to know what the natural motion of something is, you let it go and see what it does when it's not being pushed around by anything else. So that's why the nature of heavy things is to fall, and the nature of light things is to rise. And then animals and plants have very complicated natures. They're natural phenomena, obviously. They have very complicated natures because they have very complicated motions, and they grow and locomote and reproduce and do all kinds of things out of their own structure, not because anything outside is forcing them to do it. Um, all of that is part of physics, really is part of physics the way Aristotle thinks of it, but that part of that is biology and botany and so on. Physics then gets narrowed down to non-living phenomena. And I suppose that's part of the mechanical philosophy and various things that happen in the Middle Ages, where people become particularly interested in projectile motion because they have cannons. And by the time you have Galileo and Newton and Descartes and Newton and so on, there's the idea that what we would call inanimate matter, the principles of motion of inanimate matter, are the central focus of physics. But again, for Newton, that was just natural philosophy. And that particular part then turns out to be highly mathematizable, which you already have in the famous statement of Galileo that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, meaning geometry. And then as you develop calculus and much more powerful mathematical techniques, you find that they get great application in the motion of inanimate matter, not so much for biology or anything else. So then you get a kind of association, particularly of what we call physics, with this rather high-powered mathematics that doesn't appear in the other sciences. It was also in optics, of course. There was geometrical optics from the beginning, that if you think that light travels in straight lines, then you bring in a lot of geometrical constructions to understand optics. So I guess you end up with physics as the most mathematized science. And therefore, it has particular programmatic issues that don't show up so strongly in biology, for example. They would in chemistry, but chemistry is now a kind of high-powered physics in many cases. Is that, I'm not going anywhere with this. I'm just trying to lay the ground for so people can see what happened.
No, that's very helpful. And then today, you have questions like those we've talked about, the foundations in quantum mechanics, that are just as happily at home in a philosophy department as a physics department. But let's take something that we haven't discussed as much, like quantum gravity, where quantum gravity is obviously a very active area of research in physics departments. In some philosophy departments, some areas of the philosophy of physics, it's also a very active area of research. And is there a way that you would distinguish how the inquiries are being undertaken in a physics versus a philosophy department? Quite generally, the sorts of questions that are being asked, or the sort of work that people labeled philosophers or people labeled physicists are doing?
Yeah, in the case of quantum gravity, often the people in the philosophy department get started when there's a pretty well articulated theory, or at least mathematical formalism, to think about and to try to analyze and to try to make sense of. What is this telling me about the world? Because the math itself is math. Pure math is just pure math. It isn't physics. It's the language in which physics is written, but it isn't per se physics. So the normal thing is to have a pretty well-established mathematical formalism, which has been used to make at least some very good predictions and, one thinks, explanations. And then people in philosophy departments can kind of get to work on that as a subject matter to try to understand better how the math is being used and what the physical world would be like such that this math would be relevant to it. In the case of quantum gravity, you don't have a theory. So it's a little premature for that kind of inquiry. And for the most part, people who sit in philosophy departments don't actually construct the theories themselves. They kind of get them handed off to them. And there's nothing to hand off yet. There are various directions of research that go under names like loop quantum gravity or string theory or whatever. And philosophers may then look at those individually and sort of try to do a little bit of what you do with a fairly well-accepted formalism. But there isn't a well-accepted formalism at all that's made good predictions that have been verified. So you're in a much more speculative venue when it comes to quantum gravity. Now, personally, I think since quantum gravity is the attempt to somehow bring together in a coherent way two theories that do exist, namely general relativity and quantum theory, and that's an unusual situation where you kind of have two different theories that have each in their own realm been wildly successful predictively, and you're trying to find a single theory from which each emerges naturally in certain circumstances. I think there is a role that philosophers can play. It's not so much in constructing a proposed theory as saying, well, what really is the conceptual heart of general relativity? What's the conceptual heart of quantum theory? Can I kind of extract from the particular theory more general principles and then see, can I bring those principles together? Or do they contradict each other? If something's going to have to change to bring them together, where the change is going to occur? It seems to me that's something one can do in a kind of more speculative and less particularized way. But it's hard, you know. I mean, physicists have gotten stuck for over half a century, well, more than that, really, trying to bring those theories together. So it's not a trivial task.
I like this idea of getting at the conceptual heart and general principles. Maybe before we leave physics, I think it would be interesting to just hear something we've talked about before, but how it is in a physics department today, people might be asking such questions or answering such questions as like, what is space or what is time? And then how a philosopher might approach those same questions very differently.
Well, I think what's happened, and again, there's a large history of this in which quantum theory plays a central role. The basic philosophical question, the Platonic question, what is it? Right? TSD. What is it? What is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? What is space? What is time? What is matter? Those aren't asked as directly and clearly in physics departments nowadays as they were when they were doing classical physics. I mean, really before the advent of quantum theory. So, and because quantum theory did not come with any clear exposition of what the world was like according to the theory, and not only without any clear exposition, but with Bohr and some others saying, look, don't ask that question anymore, right? Don't ask for certain kinds of understanding or certain kinds of explanations. They've come to an end, right? They don't exist. You're just gonna waste your time trying to understand this theory. So if you take that to heart and you're teaching physics, you don't raise these questions to your students, and they don't get the idea that they're reasonable questions to ask. often what's superseded those straightforward questions, like, I mean, Newton and Leibniz arguing over whether space and time are fundamentally relations or not, or whether they depend on matter or not. I mean, they had these very straightforward clashes over fundamentals there. Physicists have become real good at math, and probably more often than not, what they're doing in a physics department is saying, all right, I've got this mathematical formalism over here and this mathematical formalism over here. Can I kind of knit them together or find some more general abstract framework in which they both fit or whatever, something like that? And, but that's not so much trying to distill out fundamental physical principle as to just make things mathematically consistent or coherent. And it's because that's more or less what they're more trained to do. The people who go into physics and are interested in just straightforward physical questions like what the heck is an electron anyway? Where I don't mean that in any spooky sense, but like, is it a particle that always has a location? Is it more like a field that's spread out? I mean, those are just different possibilities. They tend not to be encouraged in those kinds of questions in physics departments. And those are exactly the kinds of questions that are encouraged in philosophy departments, which is why some people who are trained in physics drift over to philosophy because they're interested in those questions. But I think in an ideal world, a lot more of what's done in philosophy departments now would be done and appreciated in physics departments, but we don't live in an ideal world.
No. Unfortunately, no, we do not. When we sat down to have this conversation 30 minutes ago, we said, okay, we would see where this goes. And neither of us really had an agenda for this conversation. And something that just occurred to me while you were talking is I have I don't still have a babysitter, but when I was a kid, I had a babysitter, and she's still a very close family friend. And at one point, when I said I was studying metaphysics in graduate school, she said she really wanted to see like the books, and I asked why, and she's like, "Well, she finds ghosts and spirits very fascinating."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're obviously much more steeped in the world of philosophy than I am, though I'm certainly in it to some extent, and it's easy to lose sight that we use words very differently and have a different understanding of what philosophy is than the typical person. And I think one question that is often asked is, what is metaphysics? And given that metaphysics is closely related to physics, and this is a conversation about what philosophy is, and you have written extensively about what metaphysics is and the relationship to physics. Maybe before we depart physics, I should ask you how metaphysics came to be and how it's related to physics.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've probably told you this story, but I'll tell it again. I've told it many times. It astonishes me a bit that because it's so simple that people haven't taken this to heart. Um, the term metaphysics did not exist in antiquity. It wasn't a thing. Um, it just didn't convey, it wouldn't convey anything to Plato or Aristotle or so on. They would have never heard of it. Uh, the term itself has come down to us, and I know we've talked about this because a later editor, I think you even have an idea of who it was, stuck the name ta metaphysica on a bunch of manuscripts by Aristotle. It's not a word that occurs in those manuscripts. And of course, what happens today is people hear metaphysics and they think it's like beyond physics or super physics or outside of the realm of physics. They think the meta means, I don't know, super duper or spooky, right? You go into Barnes and Noble and look at what they have shelved under metaphysics, and yeah, it's about ghosts. It's about tarot cards and Kabbalah and stuff like that. And this has nothing to do with it. It has absolutely nothing to do with metaphysics, right? Metaphysics, what Aristotle was doing was just what we professional philosophers call ontology, which was a term that actually used to scare physicists a lot. They're used to it now. I think they've kind of gotten the hang of it, but you'd say ontology and they'd go pale. And ontology, for those of you who've forgotten your Greek, is just the account of what exists, ta onta. So you're asking a very simple question. What is there? What exists? And if you ask it in the most general way of anything that exists, what sorts of things exist, and you're not asking in particular detail, like you don't want to know, is there a bug under that rock? That's not, but at a generic level, what sorts of things exist? That is ontology. And for sure, physicists do that all the time. They want to know, are there axions, right? Is there dark matter? That's an ontological question. Um, you know, are protons made of quarks? That's an ontological question. They're doing ontology. And therefore, they're doing metaphysics. They're coming up with theories which postulate what really exists. Now, if you take the entire realm of what exists, you might have the view that everything exists is somehow physical. That's called physicalism. And you might have the view that some of what exists isn't at all physical. That's often called Platonism, like mathematical objects, right? If you think that they're mathematical objects and they don't exist in space and time, which they wouldn't, then that's a part of your ontology. A physicalist will reject it because they think everything that exists is a physical object that moves, that has an internal principle of motion and rest. And the number 2, if it exists, doesn't have an internal principle of motion and rest. That's ontology too. So you can sort of say you've got the broad field of ontology, which is about everything that exists. Then for Aristotle, physics was a sub-branch of that, dealing with those things that exist insofar as they have internal principles of motion and rest, as insofar as they have natures. If the number 2 exists, it's not a natural object. The study of it wouldn't be a natural science. It would be mathematics, which is not a natural science. So that's all metaphysics is. It's just asking what is there, which is not only not a spooky question. I mean, of course, if there are ghosts, that's part of metaphysics too, because there are ghosts. They'd be funny kind of things, not like other things, and you seem to be of a different type than tables and chairs. And you'd be concerned about understanding what they are and how they work and what they're made of. But the question, is there dark matter, which is something that a bunch of physicists and cosmologists are very busy trying to answer, that's a metaphysical question because it's a question about what there is. So there's been all kinds of misunderstanding of people looking at the word metaphysics, completely unaware of where it came from and probably pretty unaware of the Greek anyway, and making up a meaning for it that has nothing to do with what it meant. Now, this got a bit messed up by Kant. Lots of things got a bit messed up by Kant because he decided to assert that metaphysics must be a priori. That is, that metaphysical theories, your reasons for believing them can't be based in experience. Now, that's not something that Aristotle believed. It's not something that Descartes believed. It's not something that Newton believed or Galileo believed. They were, very interested in using their experience as information or tests of different theories of what exists. Kant kind of messed it up. Now, if you say, well, by definition, metaphysics can't appeal to experience, then it's got to be shived off from what we call empirical science by definition. But that was just Kant's decision. And it, no reason to go along with it. Bad idea. no real justification for it. And so if you don't do that, then it's just a triviality that physics, part of it, the part of it that asks questions like what really exists, is part of metaphysics.
When Aristotle was doing what we now call metaphysics and what might have been slapped together and labeled metaphysics, so ontology, what was the connection that you think he had in mind between ontology and physics?
Yeah, I mean, the main connection one can get directly out of his writings was that he called what we call metaphysics, I mean, what he was doing there, the theory of being as such, he calls that first philosophy. And he explicitly calls what he called physics or natural science second philosophy. So he himself saw them as kind of closely aligned. But the difference is that first philosophy is more general. In fact, in the book we call Metaphysics, there's some philosophy of mathematics. And again, mathematical items are not natural items. They don't have natures. They don't move. They don't change. So he himself saw first philosophy is the broader umbrella. And second philosophy, physics, covers all natural items. But if you think that things exist that aren't natural, then the general theory of existence will have a broader scope than natural science. And of course, there are things that exist that aren't natural in the normal in an obvious sense. If you say, well, books exist or cars exist, but anybody would say a car is not a natural thing, right? It's not a natural thing. It's an artificial thing. And so a car, qua a car, does not fall under physics. It doesn't have a nature, but it exists, right? So in a way, there's a metaphysics of cars, which is trying to explain what does it take for there to be a car. I mean, Aristotle even talks about these things like books. What does it take for there to be a book? Well, you've got to have pages and they've got to be glued together or somehow sewn together, right? He talks about artificial objects that are considered to be substances, individual things, and their principle of unity is external to them. It's not a natural principle. It's they were nailed together or, stuck together by somebody, by an artisan. And so there's a kind of metaphysics of those in the sense of explaining what it takes to be a thing like that, but they don't fall under natural science because they're not natural things. Biology, of course, biological items, which are the primary examples of substances for Aristotle, are natural things. And they have principles of unity, and they also have all kinds of sources of motion inside themselves that support these unifying activities and so on. So that's why he spent so much time on biology. He didn't think much. He thought rocks and things like that, yeah, they were natural, but they weren't very interesting because all they did was fall, right? Their only natural motion was to drop. Whereas a fish, right, or even an oyster has a whole lot of stuff going on in it naturally, and you want to understand how that's all unified and what it's all for and how it all works.
Earlier, you described physics, I think you described it as the most mathematized branch of the natural sciences. And we spoke a bit about how, as methodology and a set of questions and a community around them developed, it branched out of philosophy. Though, even now, as you pointed out, physicists are interested in ontological questions and the two fields are closely related. But why does a discipline like metaphysics, or why did a discipline like metaphysics remain squarely in the philosophy department, and not, why don't we have departments of physics and metaphysics? Is this just like an uninteresting sociological question, or is there something deeper about the distinction between physics and metaphysics that has led to this disparity of outcome?
I mean, it's a good question you're asking. I think largely sociological, and you could do kind of counterfactual histories and tweak things a little bit here and there, and rearrange the institutional structure of universities and departments. Um, Certainly, you see that in biology, for example. There are philosophers of biology, and then there are biologists who we say have a philosophical temperament, and often their papers would be, you couldn't tell the difference if you didn't look at the actual address the paper came from. If you're asking questions in biology about the units of selection or something like that, you could be a philosopher of biology and you could be a biologist. Um, then you can ask, well, why do the one sit in one department and the other sit in the other department? And that really, as I say, that does have just a historical answer. If you ask particularly why the people who sit in philosophy departments, we're the dregs. I mean, we're the people who are left when other people got up and formed their own department because they had kind of narrower set of interests. Um, Not much empirical work is done in philosophy departments, as you know. So the more you're interested in doing observations and experiments, the more you're going to need your own department to support that kind of activity. I mean, there was a brief flurry of experimental philosophy that went on. I think it's damped down a bit, where the idea was that philosophers were going to be going out doing more empirical work, um, in the nature of asking people questions about what they believed and so on. Um, it's not, as far as I know, that's not quite as vigorously pursued nowadays. Nothing wrong with it. No reason why a philosopher wouldn't, in the course of their normal work, come up against a question that would be better addressed by doing an experiment or taking a survey or something. Doesn't often happen. So you do get this association of the sciences with experimental and observational method, and a lot of philosophers are doing work that observation doesn't bear on so directly. But then you have the weird thing that the math department's also in the science department, and it's completely non-empirical, right? They don't do experiments, they don't do observations either. And what many mathematicians do, if it gets more abstract, goes over into mathematical logic, which goes over into logic, and it's the same thing that a logician will be doing in a philosophy department. So this departmental structure that's developed in the university is very, I think, historically contingent and couldn't be justified on some abstract grounds.
Mhm. I can think of, I mean, some banal sociological reasons that metaphysics might have stayed in philosophy. I mean, physics departments are earning a lot of money, or they have at times, and you're getting patents for them. And as you said, you need a lot of specialized equipment for running experiments. Nobody's really getting metaphysics patents or creating metaphysics inventions and earning lots of money. So that's one reason we can just leave it where it is. But something interesting about mathematics and about physics that isn't clearly the case with philosophy is that there is, I mean, this agreed upon methodology. So proof from axioms for mathematics, or experiment for physics. Though I mean, a lot of physics isn't experimental. But is there agreed upon methodology within metaphysics? Is that possibly another reason why it hasn't sort of matured into its own discipline?
Um, yeah, there's no agreed upon methodology for sure. Um, I mean, just historically, for people who are interested in this, if you go back to Leibniz, so Leibniz had a view, very clear view that he pushed rather hard. Um, and he said, well, there is a single principle, which is the principle of all of logic and mathematics, all of it, which is the principle of non-contradiction. which sometimes people call also the principle of contradiction, oddly enough, but okay. Anyway, it's the same principle. Um, and he said from that, really, you get all of logic and mathematics. That turns out not to be true, okay, but that was kind of a neat package. And then he said, now, metaphysics, he said, up until the work of Leibniz, has been this kind of weird hodgepodge of people doing this and that and not quite knowing what they're doing. But he said, I have found the single fundamental principle of all metaphysics, which is the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, he just says this, right? He just argues for it. He says, look, principle of sufficient reason goes beyond the principle of contradiction. And I'm going to put metaphysics on a solid foundation by showing how you can derive all of these results in metaphysics, that is in ontology, from the principle of sufficient reason. Now, if you know your Leibniz, he sure gave you a metaphysics. He gave you an ontology called the monadology. And he said, ultimately, the entire universe is made up of a bunch of monads, and they're windowless, and each one is different than the other, and they all operate by an internal principle of dynamics, and they've all been pre-established harmonically by God. I mean, this whole deal, right? But that was fundamentally answering the question, what is there? Answer, monads. That's what there is. What do they do? Well, they all, things appear to them, and they appear in a certain sequence, and that's all determined by God. And if you got rid of all the monads except you wouldn't notice, because they're windowless and there's no real causation. I mean, all of that is a ontology in your face, metaphysics in your face. And he said, I can reduce it all now to a single methodological principle, derive it all from the principle of sufficient reason. Now, why didn't that unify the field? Because it didn't work. I mean, it just, it's not right. He had the ambition to do that. It just was a failed ambition. And he ended up fighting with Newton and kind of being on the wrong side of many of those disputes. Kant, of course, had it, thought he was gonna, he complained that metaphysics doesn't make any progress, and people are still arguing over what they were arguing about 2,000 years ago. And he was going to put it all on a new foundation and do transcendental arguments and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden it would make steady progress again, right? That turned out not to work either. Why? All his arguments were all wrong, and he makes all kinds of modal mistakes and blah, blah. I mean, you can go into the details. I don't think, quite honestly, if either Leibniz or Kant had succeeded in convincing everybody they were right, that then you'd move them out of the philosophy department. I don't think it's as simple as, if people are still fighting about it, then leave it in philosophy. And once enough of them agree, let them set up their own tent somewhere. There's all kinds of very vigorous disputes in economics departments. And, I mean, it's not that's just too cartoony. And it's not because there's a deeper principle, but there's just a shallower principle. I mean, all of this is organized on very contingent historical grounds.
I had a discussion about this issue of progress in philosophy with Chaim Gafman on maybe it could even be the first episode of this podcast years ago, and he's very pessimistic, and just in general, and said something to the effect that all philosophical programs fail. They don't end up giving us the right answers, but they give us insight, and that's very important. And maybe he would say that this gathering of insight and this refinement of questions is progress. But it seems like physics programs do succeed at times, others fail. Do you think that there is progress in metaphysics? We can restrict ourselves to metaphysics, and if so, like, what does that progress look like?
Well, first of all, the funny thing was when you said he's very pessimistic because he says all these metaphysical programs fail. And I just said Leibniz failed and Kant's failed. And yeah, I agree with that. But, there's this famous argument by Larry Loudon called the pessimistic meta-induction involving physics. You say all the physical programs fail, right? Newtonian mechanics failed eventually. Maxwellian electrodynamics failed eventually. You know, so if the fact that these attempts at giving a kind of final theory haven't worked out, if that's enough to say it fails and say there's no progress, then there's no progress in physics either. It's not as if philosophy is unique in that respect. But no, I think, yeah, I think physics has not come to any final theory. Philosophy has certainly not. Metaphysics, ontology certainly has not. I mean, the as I said, physics is doing ontology, and certainly until the physicists have at least got that little corner knocked out properly, metaphysics won't be finished either. It's not like you could finish metaphysics without having a completed physics, because physics is in part about what exists and what it is, and what its fundamental nature is, and so on. If you haven't worked that out, you haven't finished ontology yet. Is there progress? Sure, there's progress. I mean, the things that fail, you make progress when you understand why they failed. You correct some mistakes or some oversights or so on. I think that well done metaphysics, ontology, by philosophers today is better than the best we had 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I really think it is better. Much more subtle, much more powerful analytical tools. That's not to say any of it's right, but I would say exactly the same thing about physics. Physics is in certain ways better than it was 100 years ago, but it certainly hadn't gotten to the end. And you might even say that it's in much murkier situation now than it was. The theories out there are harder to get your head around, and there's no agreement about how to understand them. So I don't really see a lot of difference there. Of course, because the empirical sciences are in the business of making predictions that you can quantify. And you can say, as everybody does, that we've figured out a way to predict the anomalous magnetic moment of the electron to 14 decimal places. And on top of that, to measure it to 14 decimal places. And by God, those numbers turn out to be the same within error bounds. That's impressive, right? There's no, I mean, a philosopher hasn't done anything that impressive. I don't know how they would. But then again, neither is a biologist. I mean, biologists have never predicted anything to 14 decimal places, and they never will. Economists have never predicted anything to 14 decimal places, and they never will, much less measure it and have them come out right. So, I mean, that is an impressive feat. And it does indicate that there's something about that predictive mechanism that must be onto something. I mean, that can't just be coincidence. But I mean, if you want to get into a dark and pessimistic mood, you can get in a dark and pessimistic mood about all these subjects, right? People get in very dark and pessimistic moods about physics for sure. It's not making any progress anymore. We don't know what we're doing, and so on. All these same words. I don't think it's a good use of one's time to worry about that, because what you should be doing is focusing on some concrete problem where you think you might be able to make some progress. And there are concrete problems that come up in philosophy, and there are concrete problems that come up in physics, and so on.
I was glad that when we talked about, I mean, we're exclusively talking about physics, I don't know, half an hour ago now, I asked you about quantum gravity, and I asked you about what space and time are. I'd like to ask you, before we move on from metaphysics, just about one particular metaphysical question, so that, well, okay, let me ask the question. You mentioned physicalism earlier, and I take it that you're not a physicalist. And what I want to ask you is, why are you not a physicalist? But in answering that, my hope is that you can tell me a bit about how this question even came to be, and then how you think about it, or how a philosopher thinks about answering the question that makes this distinctly a philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, okay, let me try. Um,
Thank
so
you.
if I mean, again, so what tools do we have? We don't have laboratories. We make fine distinctions, right? And the first thing, if you want to say, are you a physicalist? You want to say, well, what exactly is that doctrine that you're asking me to sign up for or reject? And you say, well, that's the doctrine that everything that exists is physical. And therefore, I guess, depends on physics, right? That the physical, whether it exists or not depends on physics. There's some kind of way that if physics had been different, then any physical thing might not have existed if the physics wasn't there, if you will. Okay, good. Let's call that physicalism, that everything that exists is physical. Now you say, all right, you think tables and chairs and cats and so on are physical? I say, yeah. I even think human beings are, right? I don't think they have immaterial souls the way Descartes did. So I'm fine physicalist about you and me. I think we're both ultimately physical things. But on the other hand, I'm quite convinced they're mathematical truths, right? And they're just truths. And I'm convinced that any truth has to have, there must be something that makes it true. And whatever makes mathematical truths true isn't physical, because if it were, then you could change math by changing physics. And you can't change math by changing physics, right? You can't change the fact that, 2 + 2 = 4 by changing physics. Goldbach's conjecture is that every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 primes. I think there's a fact about that. I think that it's either true or false, and what makes it true or false has absolutely zero to do with physics. I couldn't say, well, if physics comes out this way, then Goldbach's conjecture would be true, and if it comes out some other way, then Goldbach's conjecture would be false. It didn't make any sense, right? That it's not about physical objects, it's about the integers. And so, yeah, I think there are mathematical truths, and in some sense, mathematical objects or mathematical structures that are not physical things, but there are facts about them. They are certain ways. Therefore, I'm not a physicalist. It's that simple. Um,
And then would it be the further work of the metaphysician to determine, okay, so we've established ontologically that there are things about which statements like 2 + 2 are true. Is it the further work of the metaphysician to determine what those things are like, if they're not like physical objects? Or
yeah, I mean, insofar as you can, it would be the job of someone interested in the foundations of mathematics. Now, such a person might live in a math department. They don't have to live in a philosophy department. If you're interested in the fundamental question of the nature of mathematical truth and mathematical items, you are thereby doing ontology, you are thereby doing metaphysics, whatever department you live in. Now, I think some of the work there has been a little confusing and maybe not as rigorously stated as it should be. So just to take an example, you say, all right, there are all these, I just gave you a fact, or there's a fact about the integers, I claim. Namely, Goldbach's conjecture is either true or false. I don't know which. Nobody knows which. My guess is that it's true, but I don't know that it's true.
and for those of our listeners who don't know what Goldbach's conjecture is.
Yeah, so as I said, every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 primes. That's the conjecture. I don't see how it could fail to have a truth value. If someone says, oh, it's just indeterminate, how can that be indeterminate? I mean, either there's an even number greater than 2 that's not the sum of 2 primes, or there isn't. I mean, I don't really understand what they're thinking. But then you say, but what are the integers? That's a good question. How does one go about that? Well, part of it is to talk about the structure of the integers. What kind of structure do they have? Some of that was nailed down by a guy named Peano in what are called the Peano axioms. And he says, well, the integers, the counting numbers, here's some things that are true of them. Everyone has a successor, right? The successor of 7 is 8. The successor of 12 is 13. The successor of 0, you start with 0. The successor of 0 is 1. And only one of them isn't itself a successor, namely 0, because these are just the, positive, non-negative integers. So that's a fact about them. And, he wrote down these axioms. Now, it turns out, I think nobody questions that all those axioms are true of the integers. It turns out they're necessary but not sufficient condition, because you can come up with structures that satisfy those axioms but aren't the integers, the so-called non-standard models. Okay, so this is starting to get at what is the nature, what is the structure of the integers, right? What makes them the integers, if you will. But then people got a little confused, I think, and they started doing set theory. And they noticed that in set theory, you can create models of the integers. You can create structures that are made out of sets, but which satisfy these same axioms, right? So in kind of the simplest way to do it is in set theory. The amazing thing in set theory is you can kind of, as it were, create an entire infinite universe out of nothing. Why? Because you have the empty set, right? That's a set. It's a set with no elements. Then you have a different set the set whose only element is the empty set. That's 2 sets of curly brackets. And then you have the element whose only element is that one I just mentioned. So that's 3 sets of curly brackets. And all of these are different sets. And you kind of immediately see, okay, there must be an infinite collection of sets. And furthermore, they satisfy the Peano axioms. And furthermore, they really look like the integers. It's like the empty set corresponds to 0, and this set whose only element is the empty set, that corresponds to 1, and the set whose only element is the set whose only element is the empty set, that corresponds to 2, and so on. I mean, there are different ways to do it. That's one way to do it. And then that's all correct. And you say, okay, I can, as it were, create models of the integers within set theory. Then some people said, oh, that shows that the numbers are sets. That, it seems to me, doesn't follow at all. Right? It doesn't tell me that what the integer 2 is a set. It just tells me that I can model the integers in set theory. I can model them in lots of other things too, right? It just says that if you're willing to accept the existence of sets, there's a whole bunch of stuff that has a whole bunch of structure. And a lot of it is mathematical structure, and some of that mathematical structure corresponds to the structure of the integers, which are interesting results. How far can you go with that? How far can I go with these set theoretic constructions and so on? Those are interesting questions. I don't think they're exactly settling the question what the number 2 is by saying, oh, it turned out to be a set. That doesn't strike me as the right thing to say there. What is exactly the right thing to say, I think, is subtle and hard. And I don't do philosophy of mathematics. And that would be a full-time job, right? Leave all the physics aside and just try and understand the nature of mathematics and mathematical items and so on. I mean, that's a great, interesting, to me, fascinating question. One with no empirical feedback, right? You're not going to get a result out of the Large Hadron Collider that makes a difference one way or the other to it. And I maybe I could be pulled into becoming a philosopher of mathematics, but I wasn't. I do kind of like I like tables and chairs and dogs and stuff, and they're all physical things. So
I really appreciate that answer. But before we leave metaphysics behind, I'm wondering if we can return to. I asked you a very big question with lots of moving parts. I'm wondering if it's possible for you to kind of analyze your answer and tell me what was what what was distinctively philosophical, or what the metaphysical sort of tools were you used in, or you use in answering this question, why you're a physicalist? What the philosophical methodologies are that are involved, because you didn't appeal to experiment, for instance.
Right. I mean, of course, any argument has to have premises that you find quite plausible, or it doesn't serve its function. Um, for example, I said, look, what I believe with all my heart is that this claim that Goldbach considered is either true or false. Either it is the case that all the even numbers greater than 2 can be written as the sum of 2 primes, or it isn't the case. There's no middle ground there, right? It's not like there's no vagueness in that statement. There's no kind of, concepts that you're not quite sure what you're talking about. So you can't get you can't get a kind of failure of truth or falsity, as you sometimes do, just because your terms are a little vague and so on. It seems to me is a perfectly sharp question, and it goes one way or the other. Now, that's the first thing I said, and I said, well, if it's true, there's something that makes it true. What is that thing? That's a good question, but there's something, right? And whatever that third point, whatever that thing is, it ain't physical, because I can't imagine a change in physics altering the truth value of that statement. So whatever it is that makes it true isn't physical. There's something that makes it true. Therefore, there's, as it were, non-physical structures or non-physical facts. Therefore, I'm not a physicist. That seems to me to be a pretty straightforward argument. I mean, what tools did I use? I just used logic. You can try and get off the bus somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where you're going to get off. I mean, if you try to get off it by saying, I just think that Goldbach's conjecture could turn out neither to be true nor false, I just don't. I mean, it seems to me you're really obligated. That's a very strange thing to say. I mean, you're really obligated to back that up with something other than I don't know. I want to be a physicalist. Anybody can reject a claim because it conflicts with something they want to believe, but that's not an argument. So what are you going to say? If you say, yeah, it's either true or false, what makes it true or false? Are you going to claim something physical makes it true or false? How could that be? How could the structure of the physical world make a whit of difference to that particular issue? Again, you can say that, but man, I would need some very compelling, non-obvious answer, which I've never seen anything even in the neighborhood of. So that's the best you can do in any field. You put out arguments, you base them on premises which strike you as things that nobody would question without some very concrete, specific reason to question them, and you see what follows. And in this case, I think the falsity of physicalism follows. So that's why I'm not a physicalist. It's not it did, I didn't come into the game wanting to be or not to be a physicalist, right? It's not like I'm aimed at that as a result. I just go through that little argument in my head and I say, yeah, that seems to be trouble for physicalism there.
Is it safe for you to say that logic is the main tool of philosophers, or philosophy as you practice it?
Well, reasoning is. If you want to call reasoning logic, I mean, logic can have, again, now we'd have to go and what do you mean by logic? That's not, it's not a cut and dried question either. And there are different kinds of logic and modal logic and temporal logic and intuitionist logic and blah, blah, blah. It's not like logic is just some pristine thing. But reasoning, I mean, yes, it is a mark of philosophy, but of a lot of other things as well, to be based on careful systematic reasoning, where you're trying to lay out in a very clear way the premises and lay out in a very clear way the steps that take you from the premises to the conclusion. Now, it might be a deductive argument where you think the conclusion just follows of necessity from the premises. It might be an inductive argument where you admit it doesn't, but nonetheless, it seems the premises make the conclusion very plausible, and you'd be inclined to accept the conclusion unless somebody brought some counter argument. I mean, this is just reasoning, right? And it is the only tool that a certain kind of philosophical question has, because experiments and so on don't bear on it. So, kind of the only thing you have to go on is very careful thinking. And this is what motivated Plato. And it explicitly motivated him to look at geometry and say, my God, in geometry, I can prove stuff. I know it's right. In geometry, I can prove that the square built on the diagonal has twice the area of the original square. I can prove it. It's not a guess. It's not based on measurement. It's not, something. Look at what Euclid did, as it were. Look at all the stuff he could prove. And then you say, but these squares you're talking about, are they physical? No, they're not physical. I mean, Plato was very clear about that. You can draw a thing you call a square, but it's not a square. It would have to have infinitely thin lines and be perfectly straight. And, the thing you draw isn't like that. So what is the square I'm thinking of? Well, it's the one I'm thinking of. It's the one that I have access to through my mind. This is what the whole, analogy of the cave is about, is turning your attention from the physical world that you get access through your senses to this other world, the intelligible world, that you get access to through your mind, just through thought, sometimes aided by senses, right? Aided by diagrams and so on that you can look at. But those are just aids. They're not really the subject matter. I mean, that's what Plato argued. I think that's all correct. And a lot of what philosophers do, if they're going to do it at all, is largely depends on this very careful thinking and laying out arguments from premises to conclusions, and going over the arguments and looking for gaps and looking for alternatives and alternative explanations and so on. And this is all kind of stuff you can do, in your office without machinery around you. You just have to think hard.
I actually think I do want to linger on metaphysics just a little bit longer. But before that, I don't think any conversation on this show about what philosophy is would be complete without this somewhat controversial question, which is, what is the distinction between Continental and Analytic philosophy? Is there such a distinction? Do you prefer one, or think one is more or less valuable? But maybe we should start with what the two types of philosophy are for people who haven't heard of them.
Yeah, I mean, probably everybody has heard these terms. I don't think there is any definition that can be given that's of much use here. I'll actually say something that might be useful historically. So there's a piece I teach a lot that was written by Rudolf Carnap, when he was young and really gung-ho, called The Elimination of Metaphysics Through the Logical Analysis of Language. And the stated aim of that piece is to kill metaphysics. And to show that metaphysics isn't merely false, it's nonsense, it's gibberish. It literally means nothing. Flatus vocus, as the Romans would say. It's mere breath. Okay? Which you'd think it might be odd. Here I am defending metaphysics, and I always start teaching elimination of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language. Well, isn't Carnap your enemy? The question is, who was Carnap's enemy? What did he mean by metaphysics? Now, there's a footnote you have to look at carefully. I think he put it in later, where he says something like, look, what I mean by metaphysics is just a kind of group of people. I'll give you some names like Heidegger and Hegel, and you'll get the idea. That's what I mean. And he says, there's other things that people might call metaphysics, which is fine by me, scientifically induced stuff, and so again, it's you had this sense, he had this sense that there were some people who were philosophers who were writing things that were getting a whole lot of attention that he just thought were incoherent gibberish. And more or less, he's trying to give you examples. And I pretty much agree with his examples. I think what he cites from what Heidegger wrote is incomprehensible gibberish and no good. And I don't like Hegel, and I'm really not all that fond of Kant, which puts me in kind of a minority. But I think Kant made it popular to write in an impenetrable style. Let me put it that way. Hume wrote in an absolutely pellucid style. So did Descartes. So did Leibniz. So did Galileo. So did Newton. Kant, And it was after Kant that you got a bunch of people writing in a kind of impenetrable, weird style. It's that part of what some people mean by continental philosophy is things written in that style or in that are kind of inherited from those people. And sometimes they add phenomenology, although I think phenomenology it depends on how it's done. That's a much more questionable case. But it's not a doctrine, and analytic philosophy is not a doctrine. What I think is important, and what Plato already thought was important, was to be aware that language is slippery, that words can have ambiguous, that arguments that look on the surface to be valid can be invalid. There were all kinds of linguistic tricks and sophistical arguments. I mean, Plato talks about refuting sophistical arguments. Aristotle has a whole document, a whole piece on sophistical refutations, bad arguments that sound good at first glance and that you can be taken in by. And so there's a turn of mind that's very wary about that and tries to make the claims as clear as possible, tries to define terms where they might be ambiguous, tries to lay out the arguments in a very systematic way so you can review them. There's a wonderful, at the end of Hume's inquiry, he talks about different kinds of skepticism. And he says a moderate skepticism is that. A moderate skepticism is where you're always a little doubtful. Maybe you've made a mistake and you try to say everything clearly and review your arguments step by step because you can make slips. And, that kind of rigor and that kind of care and attempt at clarity, that I think is a great virtue, and it's a necessary virtue if you're dealing in a case where experiment can't hit you in the face and tell you you're wrong, because basically you're relying on argumentation. And then the argumentation has to be right, and you have to be very careful about that. I think insofar as there's anything in this division, it's between those people who are kind of coming out of formal logic, where everything's really rigorous, and like to have arguments with clearly stated premises and definitions of unfamiliar terms and so on, and everything laid out so you can check it. Just that turn of mind, as opposed to people who just are somehow attracted to things that are obscure and difficult and hard to understand. And you get all these Gnostic pronouncements, right? Like Bohr would give, or Wheeler, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, it's proof you don't understand it, which means nobody understands it. Or, I mean, Bohr used to say, I think Bohr or Wheeler, one of them, the mark of a deep truth is that its negation is another deep truth. And you're going, what the hell? I mean, that's a contradiction, right? It's not a mark of anything true that if you negate it, you get something true. It's a mark of something true that if you negate it, you get something false. So there's this, some people have a kind of attraction to this, what I would just say is obscurity and kind of semi-mystical, that's contrary to what I would say the spirit of what's called analytic philosophy is. But that's all it is.
Another metaphysics problem that, other than like physicalism, for instance, that I think of as being very old and still a debate that is alive, is this question about identity. Well, it is an identity question. It's a question about whether, for instance, if you have a statue, is there just one thing there, or are the clay and sort of like the shape or the form of the statue, or are these two different things? One or two? And the reason that I bring this up right now is we talked about logic maybe being one of the fundamental tools that a philosopher has. And then you couple that though with these intuitions that people have about what premises we ought to select or take as true for purposes for our argumentation. And I'm wondering if we can look at that problem and think about maybe how you answer it, and then how somebody who doesn't agree with you answers it, and see if it really is maybe like a problem or a different use of logic there, or just intractable an intractable disagreement about intuitions.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an age-old question. The term that appears when you ask the question that I think you need to clarify is the word thing. In other words, you say, I've got the statue and I've got the clay of which the statue is made. Are they the same thing or different things? As if the word thing itself there is entirely clear. Let's just go through some of the standard arguments for people who haven't heard this. So here's an argument, a pretty clear argument, to the conclusion that they can't be the same. I start with a lump of clay. It's not a statue. Then I form it, I knead it. After a while, I say, voila, now I have a statue. It's made of that same lump of clay. We imagine all the clay is still there. I didn't carve any of it off, or I just reformed it. Now I've got a statue. And then I squish it, into a little disc, and now the statue's gone, the clay's still there. And then you say, well, look, of course, it can't be that the statue and the clay were literally the identical item, because there was a time when one existed and the other didn't, right? There was a time before the statue came into existence and the clay was already there, and there was a time after the statue went out of existence and the clay is still there. And so they can't be the same thing, right? And then you say that seems right. And then you say, well, go to the time when the statue does exist. Do you really want to say there are two things sitting in front of you, the statue and in addition the clay? Now, it's this and in addition that doesn't sound quite right, right? Because then you'd say, well, but gee, the statue weighs 4 pounds and the clay weighs 4 pounds, and I've got both a statue and a clay weighing 4 pounds. I guess I've got 8 pounds in front of me. You go, well, that's wrong. You only got 4 pounds in front of you. So surely that's not the right way. If you want to say they're different, if you want to make a distinction between the piece of clay and the statue, it's not the same kind of distinction that you make between a statue and a copy of the statue, where if you've got the statue and the copy of the statue and each is 4 pounds, you got 8 pounds, right? Okay. Now, I guess, a lot of this is then just trying to state clearly how to use this language, like same thing, different thing. In everyday life, usually there's no ambiguity there and you know what you mean. But here, you're starting to use the word same and different thing in unusual ways. And you need to try to make clear how those work. And then when you're done with all that, which I think you can do, then some smart Alec's going to come along and say, okay, fine, but what if I didn't have the unstructured clay before and the unstructured clay after, but the piece of clay itself came into existence in statue form and went out of existence. It all just disappeared in statue form. So I can't say, well, there's a time when there was the clay, but no statue. So, your argument there, two things there, doesn't work anymore. And, I'm probably going to say, look, if you understand the sense in which in the first case, they were different things, even when they both existed, that'll be true here, even though there isn't a time where one exists and the other doesn't, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now we're doing a lot of philosophy, right? We're just trying to clean up all this way of speaking so it doesn't lead to manifestly idiotic things, right? I mean, to say that if I have a piece of clay that's 4 pounds in front of me, and it also happens to be a statue in front of me that weighs 4 pounds, I have 8 pounds in front of me, that's idiotic, right? That's wrong. So for sure, you need to clean up and make clear the sense of identity and distinctness you have in mind, right? So you don't get bad results like that. And, if you're clever, you can keep coming up with weird situations where you're not quite sure what to say. And then if you have this kind of analytic tendency, you say, well, let me try and really get clear about how to use this language so I don't get into any of these contradictions or don't end up saying kind of anything idiotic. Um, I'm not sure. I don't really see myself that there's anything deeply at stake in the statue clay issue. Right? I mean, it seems manifestly to be, we know what's going on. There's a bunch of clay. At a certain point, it got put into a certain form, and at a later time, it got put out of that form. That's what happened. The rest of it is how you talk about it. And I don't see that anything hangs on it, right? I don't think that anything ontological really hangs on it. You might want to regiment your language so you know how to say the things you'd want to say. And you would normally want to say, before the statue was made, the clay existed and the statue didn't, right? I mean, that's a normal thing to say. So you just notice that if you're not careful and you say some of these things you want to say and you follow what look like arguments, you end up with weird conclusions. But I don't think there's any actual interesting ontological question here. I don't see any. I think this is a case where the kind of language hygiene has gotten a little out of control because there's not an interesting question you're clearing up anymore. You're just clearing up a kind of, puzzle thing that people have made just for the sake of making puzzles. Anyway, that's my view about that.
No, that's a very fascinating answer, and it's not the way that I was. I mean, I thought you were going to have this belief, but I didn't know how you were going to answer it. And maybe we've uncovered exciting, a different tool of philosophy, which is just linguistic and conceptual clarity that I think is a bit just distinct from logic as a tool. So with the physicalism Platonism problem, you'd say that is a genuine metaphysical question that we need to address. But here we have something masquerading as a metaphysical problem, but analysis reveals to just be some linguistic and conceptual confusion.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's that's what motivated Carnap. Okay, that's what motivated Russell. That's what motivated a lot of these people, even James. I mean, they said there are certain things you're wasting your time arguing about because by clarifying the way you're using the language, the problem evaporates. And the evaporation of the problem isn't a grand new discovery or anything. It's just you were getting confused by sloppy use of language. So yes, absolutely, you have to clear away the underbrush of this unnecessary confusion. Now, when you clear it away, it's not that all of a sudden everything is clear. There's still sharp questions, right? I mean, the Platonism question is still there. I don't think that rested on a linguistic error. There are other ontological questions that'll still be there when you've cleaned up the language. But the first thing you need to do is to triage, is this a problem? Is this, as it were, a substantial problem that needs a theory? Or is it just a linguistic problem that just needs some, as it were, linguistic hygiene? And you can give clear examples of both cases. I mean, I'm sure I've told you, but I'll remind people this example of James, which is he's making exactly this point that he's out at somebody's uh, country place, and a hunting party has gone out hunting, and he stayed at home to read his books or whatever. And they come back and they say they've been arguing all afternoon. And he says, arguing about what? And they say, well, they were in the woods and there was a squirrel on a tree. And the squirrel, of course, saw them and ran to the opposite side of the tree. So you couldn't see it. And somebody wanted to see the squirrel. So he walks all the way around the tree. And as he walks, the squirrel stays opposite him all the way around the tree, right? That's what happened. You go, yeah, okay. Question. Everybody agrees to this. The man walked around the tree, right? Everybody agrees the man walked all the way around the tree. Question, did the man walk all the way around the squirrel? And they've been arguing for 2 hours about this. And James says, what the hell are you doing? Right? I mean, there's no issue of fact here, right? Everybody agrees about what happened. You're just talking about words. It depends on what you mean by walk all the way around. If you mean you walk all the way around X, if you are successively to the south of, to the east of, to the north of, to the west of, to the south of again, for example, then yes, he walked around the squirrel. If you mean successively you're in front of, to the side of, to the back of, to the other side of, to the front of, then he didn't walk around the squirrel.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about what's going on with the squirrel and the man in the tree, yeah, you see, in this sense, he walked around the squirrel. In that sense, he didn't. And you guys are just wasting your breath arguing about it, right? There's no deep fact whether he really walked around the squirrel, whatever that would mean. You just have to clear up, the different senses of to walk, what it can mean to say you walked around something. Now, usually those senses go together because usually it's, the unusual situation is that the squirrel keeps moving, so you never get behind it, right? It always has its stomach to you, as it were. You never are behind the squirrel, even though, you circle it. That was an example that he gave of, look, this is one thing philosophy needs to do. You need to just not waste your time, right? Clarify your concepts. Not waste your time in emptying arguing. This is what Hume was doing too with his empiricism. He said, look, sometimes you get into these merely verbal arguments. There's no content to them. You have to go back and ask yourself, what do these words really mean? What ideas are they associated with? And so on. And this was also a lot of what Socrates was doing. And, go back to antiquity. And there were philosophers who were very aware of the slipperiness of language and thought they needed to be very careful about different senses of terms. That is one thing you have to do. It doesn't solve all the problems. It just keeps you from pointlessly arguing over stuff that there's no real contentful issue there.
I think that discussing physics and metaphysics has been very helpful for not just elucidating what philosophy is, but elucidating how philosophy is done, maybe. But there are other branches of philosophy. I mean, what are known as like the core branches of philosophy that I think it would be interesting for us to discuss. And again, metaphysics has this fun history, and with Andronicus, the cataloger. But what is epistemology, and where did that come from? Was it already a discipline in antiquity?
Well, for sure, look, epistemology, again, you got to know your Greek. Ology, the account of, episteme. So there is a Greek term, episteme. And epistemology was attempts to give an account of what exactly episteme is. That was certainly going on in antiquity. Plato writes the dialogue Theaetetus on precisely this question. He doesn't answer it, as most Platonic dialogues make certain attempts, and then the attempts are shown to fail, and that's true here in Theaetetus. But that there was a question, what is episteme? Now, most modern English translations translate the Greek term episteme as knowledge. And then the question would be, what is knowledge? It's probably not a great translation, especially if you look at when you get into Aristotle and his account in posterior analytics. Maybe a better translation, although it's clunkier, is understanding or explanation. Anyway, there's a valuable mental state you can be in when you have episteme, and it is associated with what we would probably normally call comprehension or insight, maybe even better. When I say that, I mean, there are certain things which you can know, but you can't have that kind of insight or comprehension into, right? You might, as it were, know, in the normal sense of know, what the capital city of California is. But there's nothing that would count as having deep insight or comprehension of that or understanding of that, right? It's just a kind of random fact. It's not the kind of thing, I mean, Plato's very clear. He doesn't think it's the kind of thing of which anybody can have episteme, because there's no fundamental explanation for it. Whereas if I say, I can know or understand that the square built on the diagonal of a given square has twice the area. That's the example in Meno. It's not that I can memorize that and just parrot it back to you. That's not episteme. Episteme involves comprehension so that I can explain to you why it must be so, right? I can give an explanation of it. This is very deeply tied to what Aristotle does with his theory of the four itiae, or explanatory factors, or what's, again, sometimes often translated causes, but that's a bad translation. What is it to explain something or comprehend it or grasp it, right? To have this intellectual insight into it. That's associated with the term episteme. And then epistemology is the question, well, what do you have to do to have that? What constitutes that kind of comprehension? Now, because the word knowledge is used in other ways in English literature, sometimes epistemology as the theory of knowledge covers some of these other things, which aren't really comprehension. But that's where it began. I mean, that was what the original question was about, this very desirable state of really understanding things. And it was that kind of understanding that gave you wisdom, right? That gave you Sophia. And that's what the philosopher wants, is, right? The philosopher wants Sophia, wisdom, and wisdom is understanding or comprehension. And you show you have wisdom when you can explain things, right? Whereas, as I say, you can't explain to me why Sacramento, right? There's no deep explanation of why Sacramento is the capital of California. It could just as well have been San Francisco, right? It was just kind of a historical accident. There's no deep reason for it, the way there's a deep reason why the square on the diagonal has twice the area. So yeah, so I mean, that's what originally epistemology was. People often say, which is true, the word know in English, in many other languages, there are different terms that we translate know. In German, wissen, können, and können, right? In French, connaître, savoir. Okay, I mean, they make distinctions that we kind of lost in English, because we say, oh, yeah, I know so-and-so, meaning I'm familiar with him or I met him. Not that I comprehend him or grasp him, right? Or I know how to do something. That's a kind of ability, but it doesn't have to be accompanied with comprehension. And then there's this other thing, which is, wissen and connaître, or savoir, this kind of understanding, this grasp, this intellectual grasp of something as knowledge. That's the really valuable state that the philosopher wants, if they were doing pure theory.
Well, we discussed what sort of physics questions would be answered in a physics department today, and what sorts of questions, physics related questions, might be answered in a philosophy department, and how they overlap and how their approaches differ. Is there a department that is not philosophy that you think overlaps with epistemology, or is epistemology something that is just exclusively really done in a philosophy department?
I think epistemology, as it were, this taking a step back. I mean, in every department, there are people who want to have this kind of understanding, right? That's their goal, is to understand something, right? I mean, if you're in a genetics department, if you're doing genetics, there's stuff you're trying to understand, right? If you're in a chemistry department, um, that's all over. Then there's this kind of step back and saying, well, when you say you want to understand it, what is that? What mental state, or what do you want that will give you comprehension or understanding? I don't think anybody except in a philosophy department spends their time on that abstract question, right? One where you would see a similarity between what the geneticist wants, what the physicist wants, what the philosopher wants. They all want some kind of grasp or comprehension or understanding. Now, sometimes in a physics department more than other places, the physicists will deny they want that. They'll say, no, I don't care if I understand it. I just want to be able to predict. I want to calculate and predict. That's a kind of instrumentalism. And I think I mean, if that's all you want, that's all you want. But I think that's a sad little life you lead if all you want to do is be able to make predictions and not understand things. And a typical thing you say what could be asked in a physics in a philosophy department. Here's a plain physical question. There are things we all believe, there are things that are electrons. Okay, are they particles? Do they have locations at all times or not? That's just a physical question. It's not a philosophy question. Many physicists would decline to answer and further say they don't care. Right? They'd say, look, I don't, that's not an interesting question to me. I just want to be able to predict the outcome of this experiment. And whether an electron is located and moves around or it's smeared out or whatever, I don't care. Now, if someone says they don't care, maybe they don't care. Nothing much more I can do about that, except that's kind of pitiful to me. I think that's what's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, when we were talking about metaphysics, we said that, I mean, two big tools that a philosopher uses are logic or just reasoning, and then conceptual clarity and linguistic precision. Are there different tools at use in epistemology, or the same, or just the same, or is it really just a difference in subject matter?
Yeah, I don't see that the tools are any different when you're doing epistemology. Yeah, I think they're basically the same. I mean, there's a part of epistemology called formal epistemology, which is trying to mathematically model inference, right? Good inference, Bayesian inference, for example. Um, and that leans a bit on some real technical math.
Yeah, but there's formal
Uh,
ontology in
and
metaphysics.
there's I mean, no, I just don't, no, I think it's the subject matter. I don't think it's the tools. I think those are the basic tools of what goes by the name analytic philosophy, and they would be the same if you're doing epistemology. Yeah.
Well, then let me ask you a big, heated epistemological question that I'm just independently curious how you think about it. But the problem of like global skepticism, is there an external world? I think that's a pretty classical or classic epistemological question. And how do you go about dissecting and then answering that for yourself?
Of course, there's an external world. I mean, I don't even understand. I don't really understand. Okay, there's something that goes by the name Pyrrhonian skepticism or radical skepticism. which you can associate with Pyrrho in antiquity. People falsely believe that you can associate it with Descartes and something called the evil demon argument, which is false because he never gave such an argument. There is no evil demon argument in Descartes. Pyrrhonian skepticism, radical skepticism, was a claim that reason undermines itself. That if you try to be careful, I mean, the picture of the ancient skeptic was you started out in a state of distress, mental anguish, because you were curious about certain things and you couldn't figure them out, right? You just stayed up at night trying to work out the facts, and you just, were just driven by this. And that the Pyrrhonian comes to a point where their reasoning undermines itself. And you might say you draw the conclusion, but that's the wrong words, because the idea is that you're not using arguments at all. You sort of give up. Okay, the right thing to say is you give up. You kind of reach a point of despair, but then out of that despair, you suddenly become calm. You reach a mental state called ataraxia, which is calmness, where you don't claim you haven't settled these issues, you now sort of think they just can't be settled, and you're okay with that. You just kind of say, okay, I'll just live my life. I'll just go enjoy life, and I won't torture myself over these questions. Now, I guess that could include the question whether there's an external world, although as far as I know, that wasn't one of the ones that the Pyrrhonians talked about much. And if anybody asks you a question, like, I mean, often they were ethical questions. Is this good or bad? And your answer is no more, meaning no more one than the other. It's no more good than bad. This is no more true than false. You're just in this kind of state of amorphous indecision, and you don't care anymore. Okay. That was Pyrrhonian skepticism. Now, in the same, actually the last section 12 of Hume's inquiry on skepticism, he walks through these different types of skepticism. One of them is this radical skepticism, this Pyrrhonian skepticism or academic skepticism. And Hume just says, no, you can't do that. That's just psychologically impossible. It's just, people can't do it, right? You can't fail to believe things. You can't fail to believe there's an external world. You can't fail to believe that, if you get up and walk over to the refrigerator and open it, you'll find something to drink in it. And you can't fail to believe that, you can pour it into a glass and drink it. You're never going to be, if you were really in a situation where you thought it no more likely than unlikely that the glass of water will kill you, he says you would die. You would very quickly die, which is true because you wouldn't do anything. And he says nobody's ever been in such a state of global skepticism. And he says, and if you manage to get yourself in such a state, you'd never get out of it because there's nothing to work with, right? How could you ever get out of this kind of global skepticism? And then Hume says there's this more moderate skepticism, and moderate skepticism is just fallibilism. You admit that even for things you very strongly believe you might be wrong, you keep a kind of open mind if someone wants to give you reasons, and you'll consider them. But it's not that you don't believe it anymore. I mean, now Hume made a mathematical error at a certain point, and this is in the treatise, where he thought that if I take any question, I can raise a question about it. Now I give you an argument, but you can question whether the argument's any good, and that raises a kind of meta question. And then I can question whether that's any good, and that raises a meta question. And all of these add to more uncertainty at every step. And then since this never ends, it means all of your certainty will be reduced to nothing. That's just wrong. That's just mathematically wrong, right? Because we all know you can have an infinite sequence of increasing quantities that add to a finite amount. Okay, he was just wrong about that. But is there a doubt that there's an external world? No, there's no reasonable doubt. On what grounds would one have a reasonable doubt there's an external world? What would be the grounds? I'm just trying to understand where is this doubt supposed to come from?
Well, I suppose you can't ever tell that you're not in the Matrix or something like that. That what you're experiencing isn't all in your head.
That's just fallibilism. Again, I granted you that. So this depends. Now we're back to the definition of knowledge. If what you mean by knowledge requires absolute 100% certainty, then fine, I don't know there's an external world. Right? I'm not absolutely 100% certain, but I'm so certain, right? I mean, as it were, if I were to put it on a scale, I would put it at 99.999999% or whatever. And I'm not going to, of all the things I need to worry about in my everyday life, I don't need to worry that I might be wrong on that count, right? There are other things I can more profitably use my time, worrying where I think something's the case and it might not be the case. So if all you mean is, yes, it is, as it were, logically possible that I'm wrong, fine. But that's not a serious doubt. When we ask people to convict people in court, okay, this is a serious thing. I mean, somebody can go to jail. You ask to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all possible doubt. Maybe you can't be convinced beyond all possible doubt, but you can be convinced beyond all reasonable doubt. And that's good enough, isn't it? Do I need to be convinced beyond an unreasonable doubt? Why? It's unreasonable, that doubt. Doubts need to be backed by something. This is a point that Descartes made in Meditations. That he says the doubts that I'm not raising out of levity or lack of consideration. When Descartes raises doubts in Meditation 1, every doubt is grounded in something he already believes. When he says, maybe I'm asleep and dreaming, that's a reasonable doubt because he does believe he sleeps and dreams, right? That's why there is no evil demon argument. There is no such argument because there's no ground to believe in an evil demon. The most hyperbolic doubt that Descartes raises in Meditation 1 is not based in an evil demon. It is based in God. In God. And the reason he raises it, he says, I think God is omnipotent. So I think if God wanted to, he could deceive me. But then the answer to that is, yeah, but God is good. God is benevolent. God wouldn't trick you. And then you go through a whole series of move and counter move, and he's not quite sure what to do at the end. But the point is, Descartes begins believing in God. That's part of his given set of beliefs at the beginning of the Meditations. And his hyperbolic doubt is based not in an evil demon, but in God. Maybe God could do this to me. And if you go to Meditation 6, where he finally answers it all, he answers it by showing why God would not do that. Not that an evil demon wouldn't do it. But there was never an evil demon argument. The mention of an evil demon there is not as an argument. It is a meditative practice for certain specific psychological purposes. It is not an argument. So Descartes never has to answer it because he never raises it. He has to answer the God argument, which he does. The entire structure of the Meditations is answering the God argument in Meditation 1. Anyway, Descartes is very clear. It's not just any old doubt. You need grounded doubts. You need reasonable doubts. You need doubts that have something to back them. If someone says, I doubt the world exists, and I say, why? And they say, I don't know. I just don't know. No. Why should I take you seriously? Why should I take that seriously?
Mm-hmm. I hadn't planned on going in this direction, but I think maybe it is a good direction to end with. But I always hear, or I often hear people discuss, what are the biggest outstanding philosophical problems, the most difficult ones? And the three that I think I hear most often are probably the problem of induction, the mind-body problem and then this problem of global skepticism. And before I mean, I ask you what you think are some of the biggest outstanding problems, I just want to clarify. Am I right that you would say that this global skepticism problem just doesn't belong on that list because
Yes,
it's
and I
maybe a
don't think
pseudo
I
problem?
don't think the problem of induction, you have to separate it into two things. There's one thing that goes by the name the problem of induction, which is, can I derive a principle of induction from deductive logic? To which the answer is no, you can't. As we know, as we've proven over and over again, and proven by Hume, and proven in a different way by Goodman. Um, but I think Goodman, the answer is correct there. I mean, some inductive practice is justified. I mean, part of what we mean by being a reasonable person is that you accept some inductive arguments as at least making their conclusions likely or probable or credible. If somebody didn't do that, we would think they were insane. We wouldn't say, oh, look at how clever they are. We say, this is a lunatic, right? So there's not a problem of justifying induction by deriving it from something else. Now, there is a problem in clearly articulating inductive rules, and that's what Goodman insisted on when he said, look, there's really the problem of justification and description are really the same here. And exactly how the best inductive rules work, and Bayesianism is an attempt to answer that, for example, in a very specific way. That's still a problem, but it's not the problem of induction, like why should we believe in induction? That's just a bad problem. That's like global skepticism. If you didn't accept any inductive arguments, you'd be insane. Could I convince you of that? Well, why should I care if I can convince you of that? You're insane. Probably I can't convince you of anything. I probably can't convince you to, leave through the door rather than the window if you don't believe in induction. I don't know what to say, right? You're a lunatic. You need to be put in a hospital, not in a philosophy class. The mind-body problem, of course, is a great problem. I don't work on it because I see no prospects for solving it. I think it's a real problem. It's not a pseudo problem. The problem of making clear good inductive practice, that's a real problem, but it's not the radical problem. And global skepticism, I don't think that's a problem at all.
Okay, well, then the last question I'll ask is, what, other than the mind-body problem, do you think are some of the biggest genuine philosophical problems that are outstanding right now?
I'm I'm reluctant to even comment for the simple reason that most of my work is in foundations of physics. And most of the things I think about are in foundations of physics, and nature of space and time, and the nature of matter, and how to understand quantum mechanics. I think these are all great problems. But they're not what would pop to most people's minds as philosophical problems. Um, and in fields outside of those I work in, I'm just not familiar enough with what people do to make judgments about how interesting or uninteresting I think what they're focusing on is. I'm just not familiar enough with it. I would be reluctant to judge
Then
it.
can I ask instead then why you think the mind-body problem is such an important big problem and why you see it as intractable at this point?
Well, it's a big problem because we do have minds, we feel pains. I mean, again, the best example has to do with feelings like pains, what Nagel calls what it's like to be something. We all know there's something it's like to be a person with a toothache, and it hurts and it's bad, right? And it's something you want to avoid and you want to not induce in other people. Um, and so there is consciousness of that sort. It exists. If someone were to deny it exists, I wouldn't, they're just playing a game. Um, then there's the question, how does it come into existence? I mean, not everything I think is conscious. I don't think tables and chairs and rocks are conscious. Again, some people are panpsychists. Come on. I mean, I have very little time for somebody who says a rock is conscious. We know that we're conscious, and we know that our consciousness has something to do with our brain activity, our neural activity. but nobody knows how to articulate just what it is about a certain kind of neural activity or brain activity that creates pain, that unpleasant sensation, that unpleasant subjective sensation. That's the mind-body problem. I think that's a great mystery. I mean, again, it's more of a mystery if you do a lot of physics, because you realize you can do the physics without any consideration at all of that question, and the physics seems to go fine, right? I mean, if I just want to analyze part of your brain from a physics perspective, the fact that there's pain there or not has nothing to do with anything. It's just electrons and, ions moving around, and we think we have the physical laws that pretty much get that. Why should all of this be associated with any kind of consciousness? And more specifically, which sorts of physical processes are associated with any sort of consciousness? As far as we have no answer to that, and I don't see how you could get an answer. My problem is I don't even see a route to anything that would count as a satisfying explication, right? A satisfying understanding where you'd say, oh, now I see why cells doing such and such would be associated with a painful sensation, right? I don't even know I wouldn't know what the connective tissue for that explanation would be. Even if I just tried to make one up, it just, there I could see you could get more information about a correlation. You could say, oh, it seems as though when the brains are doing this, it's painful, and when they're doing that, it's not. But why the one and not the other? I don't even see what an explanation would look like. And so that's why I don't work on it. I wouldn't know how to make progress on it. I think it's in a way, a great mystery that there is anything conscious at all. And the kinds of consciousness and what specifically is conscious and what specific sorts of consciousness they have, all of that, I just don't think we have any good grasp on, and I don't know of any research program that would lead in the direction of an explanation. That's just my feeling about it.
Well, it's now getting late in New York City, so let me finish by asking, as we must in every episode, what is going on with the John Bell Institute for the Foundations of Physics these
Yeah,
days?
so I think I reported to you, we found a location in Split. Great location for putting on summer schools. We put together, it was largely Angelo Bassi, who was the motor of that last year, one on the foundations of physics, and it went great. We're doing one this year, end of August, on space and time, and that seems to be coming together well by the time this comes out. I mean, I can't suggest people apply to it because the application period ended. But I can say that we have enough funding to keep this going at least a few more years. And next year we will do again at least one in Split on probability and statistical explanation and thermodynamics, that kind of stuff. That's the
What
plan.
does a summer school look like, or summer program look like?
Well, what I want to do with this is to be a proper school. So it's not like a conference. It's not you get together a bunch of people who work in the field and everybody just gives their most recent paper. I mean, there are things called summer schools that more or less work like that. This is an attempt to be a much more systematic introduction and of at a level that because we want to have philosophers, physicists, mathematicians all there. So that means you can't assume any particular background. So kind of everything presented from zero with some mathematical rigor, right? With some philosophical rigor, um, in a systematic way by a core faculty over 2 weeks, basically, together with some other, kind of more speculative or, edgy things and maybe some visiting people. But the idea really is to run it as an introduction to fundamental issues from a philosophical, mathematical, physical perspective altogether.
And who is it that should be looking into attending? Like, what's your target audience?
I mean, this sort of it's a little hard to say. I would say, the immediate target are graduate students and early career faculty, but these are questions that are not treated in most physics programs or in most philosophy programs for that matter, because, philosophy of physics is a little boutiquey. Um, so it's very easy to have people who are much older who still have never had any of this material, and they're perfectly appropriate, right? But, the main idea is to get people who are kind of early-ish in their careers. Here's the foundations. If you want to think about these issues in a foundational way, here's a bunch of foundational stuff that should be helpful.
Yeah. Well, Tim, this has been another solid entry in our saga on this show. So thanks again, as always, so much for doing this with me.